Good to go? Well, thank you all for coming to this IISS discussion meeting on the strategic implications of the Iran nuclear deal. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of the IISS Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program. I'm based in London. I'm traveling to the United States for an important purpose. My son's getting married on Saturday. The secondary purpose is to talk here to you all. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Trita Parsi, a good friend, the president of the National Iranian American Council, the author of 2 award-winning books dealing with Iran, the United States and Israel. The Treacherous Alliance, the secret dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States, and A Single Roll of the Dice. I'm sure you've all read it, because if you haven't, you shouldn't be here. Trita is based in Washington, so he's sort of the home team. I'm based in London. I'm the away team, so I'm going to bat first and start off talking a bit. I travel around the world quite a bit. I talk to a lot of people. With very few exceptions, I think I can say that almost all of America's allies and friends around the world really want an Iran nuclear deal that closes off Iran's paths to a nuclear weapon and that gets trade resumed with Iran. I find it so odd when I read some of the pundits in this town say things like, America's closest allies oppose this. By closest allies, they refer maybe to 2 or 3 countries, only one of whom is really an ally in the sense of being a major non-NATO ally. Bahrain is also a major non-NATO ally, but Saudi Arabia is not. They're not an ally, as I see it. But apart from a handful of countries in the Middle East, everybody wants this deal because it will close off Iran's paths to a nuclear weapon. The 4 paths being the path of using Natanz, the declared facility at Natanz. Iran won't be able to produce the fissile material for a nuclear weapon in less than a year. Fordo will be changed to an expensive showcase. It'll keep 1,000 centrifuges, but they won't be used for enriching uranium. And I think they're going to be used for medical isotope production in a way that will make them unusable, really, to enrich uranium. The plutonium path, about which I've been pretty worried the last couple of years, we blocked off when the core of the reactor is taken out and replaced. That goes farther than I thought Iran would be willing to accept. And then the sneak-out path, Iran's willingness to accept not just the additional protocol, but inspections and monitoring that go beyond the additional protocol, the exact details of which are still being negotiated, not public. But blocking off that sneak-out path is something that will go beyond the 10 to 15 year limits of the enrichment program, and is one of the most important benefits of the deal. The deal keeps in place more than I would like kept in place. Iran refused to dismantle any machines, to close down any facilities, both as a matter of pride, and I think it's very important to recognize that the Obama administration, in realizing the importance of the pride factor, is what made this impending deal possible. But Iran also retains leverage by keeping 13,000 centrifuges in storage and by keeping Fordo open. It's their leverage for if the other side breaks the deal. And I contend that the Western powers maintain the leverage of sanctions architecture that will remain in place. I don't know exactly how the UN snapback sanctions are going to work. It was surprising to me to read the most recent story from New York that Russia and China had agreed to some kind of snapback mechanism that will put sanctions back in place. I didn't think Russia in particular was going to want to agree to an automatic reimposition of sanctions, but something like that is apparently in the works. But to me, more important than what the UN sanctions do is that the United States and the European Union have the ability to reimpose sanctions very quickly. And those are the sanctions that really matter to Iran. Those are the sanctions that have been putting such a tight economic stranglehold on. They're not killing the Iranian economy, but it's the yoke that Iran wants to get out from under. And that can be reimposed very quickly by the United States. The Europeans I talked to say that they also can reimpose their sanctions pretty quickly, because the basic council decision that agreed on the sanctions will remain in place. And it's just the regulations that the bureaucrats in Brussels have written up. That'll be either suspended or rescinded, but the basic decision remains in place, so it won't take necessarily an automatic vote of all the members of the European Union to reimpose sanctions if there's a violation. I think there's a very good chance that this deal will get done this summer. Very good chance, let's say 80%. Probably by the 30th of June, the deadline, just partly for bureaucratic and technical reasons. There's so much that remains to be done, and Iran has been reluctant to put in writing any of the details so far. They've been kicking decisions down the road, waiting until everything goes to the ministerial level at the end of the month, I guess in the hopes that Zarif, who's been dealing with this issue so much longer than the other ministers, will somehow have an advantage, and also that the time constraints at the end of the deal will mean less is written down. And for Iran, the less it's written down, the better, they think, because they have the concept that if it's not written down, it will be allowed. It's not how the other ones see it. Actually, I think that John Kerry's unfortunate accident probably plays to Western advantage. It's a reason to break the deadline, to go into July. Because otherwise, that deadline really is, I think, harmful to the Western negotiating position. The Iranians think that America's under deadline pressure and that America will therefore be more willing to make concessions in order to meet the deadline. I hope Congress will realize that and not try to enact sanctions quickly if we don't have a deal in the first week of July. Let this thing play out enough. Don't let Iran think that that Obama needs this deal quicker and needs it more than Iran does. If Iran overplays its hand, I think that's the dynamic that could mean that we don't have a deal. And we're seeing some of that in play in the ensuing negotiations right now. Other things that could break this deal would be externalities. If hardliners in Iran who don't want this deal, and they can't attack it directly because the supreme leader has given his blessing to the negotiations, they can do things on other things, seizing cargo ships or throwing American reporters in jail and sentencing them to espionage charges, things that could change the dynamic. Hardliners in other places, in the United States or Israel, could take actions that could create a dynamic that could make it difficult for Iran to go through with the deal. But I think there's so much that both have invested in the deal to date, so many compromises they've already made to date. They've made the most important compromises in Iran, accepting the limits, accepting the verification, that the last few issues they should be able to resolve. Those last few issues being, in particular, the sequencing of sanctions relief, the access that the IEA would have to military sites in the future, and dealing with the past evidence of past activities of a possible military dimension. The sanctions relief it's probably the most difficult set of issues because there's so many different kinds of sanctions. But Iran realizes that they're not going to get US sanctions removed, just suspended. And Iran also realizes that despite the Supreme Leader's statement that sanctions have to be all removed on day one of the implementation of the deal, they very cleverly defined day one to mean after a period of zero time, a zero period, when implementation will take place. Zarif said implementation might be 4 weeks or 8 weeks. I just don't know how he calculates that. I mean, they have to take out 13,000 centrifuges. If they just take them out, throw them in a box somewhere, maybe you could do it in 4 weeks. But they want to carefully take them out and keep them in reserve for future leverage purposes, taking the calandria out of the Iraq reactor and then blending down, diluting the almost, 8,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. They have to take care of that. But if they just ship it out to Russia, but it appears they want to keep it in country, so blending it down or putting it in oxide form finally, if they get their oxide conversion working properly. That's all going to take, Ernest Moniz said, at least maybe 6 months. And that 6 months won't start until the congressional review period is over. congressional review period under the Corker bill gives a 30-day review, but 60 days if the deal is done after July 9th or so. And then there's another 10 plus 12 days of president can have a veto and then a vote to try the veto. The whole congressional review process could go 82 days. So we're looking at September, and then the 6-month period of implementation starts, and then Iran gets the sanctions relief as a Nowruz present, Iranian New Year's present. Maybe they get some relief earlier. Maybe Obama will be able to allow some of the frozen funds to be remitted earlier than that. But the real sanctions relief, I don't think, will be until next spring. There's a lot of criticism of the deal. I'm not going to deal with all of them, but just to pick up a couple of them. The main concern, I think, of countries like Israel is that this deal is only for 15 years of limits or thereabouts. And then after that, Iran would be able to produce as much enriched uranium as it wants. One answer to that is, we'd be so lucky if this lasts 15 years. There's so many things that could go wrong. But the other answer is that I don't think that in 15 years Iran is going to change its stripes. But if they implement the additional protocol for 15 years, the IAEA will be able to draw the broader conclusions under the additional protocol that all nuclear activity in the country is for peaceful purposes. That's a pretty strong conclusion that the IAEA would be able to draw. And I don't think it would overcome all the distrust, but it would establish a basis of trust. If Iran implements this deal for 15 years, you have something to work on and less reason to be so concerned about a larger enrichment facility. And meanwhile, the intrusive verification measures remain in place. A second criticism is that this deal would spark a proliferation cascade in the region. And that's a serious concern. I've been worried about that for a long time. My friend Gary Seymour said the other day that actually it's in the absence of a deal that it's more likely that you have a proliferation cascade, because if there's no deal, if there's no limits on Iran's program, Saudi Arabia will be even more intent on having similar nuclear options. A deal that at least forecloses for the next 15 years Iran's path to nuclear weapons gives Saudi Arabia some time to wait. Now, Saudis have said they want any technology that Iran has. They want the enrichment technology. Where are they going to get it? I think it's fair to ask. They may want it, but there has to be a supplier. All the nuclear supplier group members are enjoined from supplying enrichment technology that would be for a weapons option. That leaves the countries outside the NSG. Israel's not going to sell it. India's not going to sell it. North Korea, maybe that's something to be concerned about and to watch. But the usual suspect is Pakistan. Pakistan would provide a nuclear weapon as sort of the usual mem. But I've been to Pakistan a lot. I talk to them quite a bit. They do not want to share their nuclear weapons with anyone, much less get involved in a fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia that would open up on Pakistan's Western Front a new strategic problem. When all of Pakistan's strategic forces are pointed toward the east, their entire nuclear regime is India-centric. And every day they fall further behind India in most aspects of their competition. They don't want to dilute their forces and have to have a potential enemy on the west. So Pakistan has no strategic interest in sharing their nuclear weapons technology with Saudi Arabia. Even if the Saudis paid for it, as is presumed, that was yesterday, thanks very much. Today is today. Not to mention the economic sanctions that the Pakistanis would be hit with, and their desire to get out of the cloud of suspicion hanging over them for the last 10, 15 years because of the AQ Khan transactions. But yeah, so we should worry about a nuclear proliferation cascade, but not assume that it's going to happen automatically, because fortunately the Saudis don't have much basis for building enrichment on their own, and I don't think they're going to be able to get it very easily. The other criticism of the deal is that it gives Iran an ability to create more trouble in the region. Jude, I think I'm going to let you handle that one mostly because you're going to talk more about Iran's reactions. But I think Obama said it pretty well when he said, Iran is already creating trouble. They don't have to spend a lot of money to do it. They don't need a lot of extra money to create more. I guess the last thing I'll say, because we want to talk about the strategic implications of this deal, and I want to say something about how Europeans look at this deal. Most of the Europeans I talk to see the deal before us in transactional terms. Will it reduce Iran's possibility to produce a nuclear weapon? Will it improve trade for countries involved? And if the answer is yes, they want this deal. And they're convinced so far that this deal works for them. Some people say the French aren't keen about this deal. The French I talk to in the strategic establishment, yes, they're a little bit harder line than others. Well, they say they're not harder line, they're just sticking to principle. But they liked what was done in Lausanne on April 2nd. They want this deal to proceed. They don't talk about it in transformational terms the way some Americans do. I know Obama is sometimes accused of seeing this deal as something that will transform Iran, transform the region. I'm going to let Trita talk to that. I don't think Obama is selling the deal. He's not counting on transformation as the reason for the deal. I think he, like the Europeans, is balancing the arms control benefits of this deal. And just on that basis alone, it's a good deal. If on top of that you get transformational benefits of a change in Iranian society, of a change in regional dynamics, that's an extra benefit, an externality, and so much the better. But that's not the way that the Europeans are counting on it. They too are hopeful. I don't think that America is going to be immediately falling in love with Iran if this deal is done. There's just so much distrust that will remain. But the fact that you have communication channels established, that Kerry and Zarif are exchanging text messages, whatever else happens, those communication channels are going to be open. And I think Iran and the United States will be able to talk more than they ever have been about many of the mutual issues, the mutual interest that they have in the region. And I'll stop there and Trita let you pick up on some of those themes.
Good. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you so much for inviting me to come and share the podium with you and talk about this issue. And thank you all for coming as well. I'm going to address two issues. First is a bit of background on how we ended up here. And I think it's important to understand that because it actually gives an answer to some of the criticisms that has been provided against the deal. And the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's at stake here and go a bit outside of just the non-proliferation territory and look at what the implications of this deal could be on a larger, in a larger picture. We start off with the first one, how we ended up here. There is a narrative very strong in this city that says that as a result of the sanctions, the Iranians were forced to come to the table and essentially there was so much leverage against them, and as a result, now for the first time ever, they are negotiating in earnest and it has enabled us to get this far. I think not only is that narrative rather simplistic, it contains a lot of errors, but it also gives birth to a lot of the criticisms against the deal. I think what happened in reality is that yes, sanctions, particularly those that were imposed after 2010, did provide the United States with a lot of leverage because they were tremendously painful to the Iranians. However, time did not stand still in Iran while the sanctions were imposed. While the United States has pursued non-diplomatic means, whether it's sanctions or what happened during the Bush administration in which there were no diplomacy at all, the Iranians continued and they aggressively expanded their nuclear program. While the sanctions were imposed from 2010, the Iranians started 20% enriched uranium. They got a stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. They added about 10 or 11,000 more centrifuges. And all of that also provided the Iranians with the very same leverage in the current negotiations. We want to get them down from 19,000 as they had, and according to the political framework, they're agreeing to come down to 6,000. That's probably more than what many people would have wished for, but it's also important to remember that in 2003, they had about 164 centrifuges. They offered to negotiate with the Bush administration. The Bush administration said no. 2005, last time that the Zarif was head of the negotiating team before Ahmadinejad got elected, they sent the Europeans a proposal offering to cap their enrichment program at 3,000 centrifuges. No answer. The cost of not answering, the cost of not engaging in diplomacy is that we went from 164 centrifuges all the way to 19,000. And that has provided the Iranians with leverage as well. And at the end of it, when we do the final calculations, we have to ask ourselves, did the leverage that we gained, did it outweigh the leverage that they gained during the same time period? And I'll leave that for others. But last time I checked, 6,000 centrifuges is bigger than both 3,000 and bigger than 164 as well. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, and that's important because there is the argument that, you know what, this deal is not good enough. We should just walk back, impose more sanctions, and we will get a better deal. Well, part of the reason why we actually came to the table is because both sides pursued an escalatory approach and they ran out of escalatory options. There were not a lot of more sanctions that the United States could have imposed on Iran without getting so close to military action, because once you ran out of all of those sanctions, the next escalatory step is actually to take military action. And the president clearly did not believe in the feasibility and the utility of the military option. Similar problem existed on the Iranian side. How much further could the Iranians have gone with their expansion of their nuclear program without getting into a point in which they either would generate an attack from Israel or get so close to actually having a bomb that the rest of the world would actually shift their opinion in favor of taking military action? The Iranians were also running a very risky game. And what happened is that we actually got lucky. The president came to realize this sometime in late 2012 and wanted to find an exit. Rouhani got elected and the exit was provided. And very quickly, the negotiations took off. There were secret negotiations taking place already during the last couple of months of the Ahmadinejad government, but they were going nowhere. Once Rouhani came in, the tone and everything changed dramatically. And now we're finally in a position in which, having exhausted the military and the escalatory options, we have realized that the best option actually is to pursue diplomacy. Now, what is at stake here? Mark has already covered, I think, the first and the most important one probably, which is that this actually would close off all paths that Iran would have for a nuclear weapon. It would have a breakout capability of more than a year, and this is the best that we can achieve under almost any circumstance. The second thing that I think is also important is that this avoids a military confrontation. Even though voices of war probably are much quieter right now, I think we have to keep in mind, if the deal falls apart, and particularly if the deal falls apart as a result of congressional action, and the entire world is in favor of this deal, but then Congress does something that causes it to crumble, then we're going to end up in a situation in which the restrictions that we have gained on the Iranian program are going to be out the window, and at the same time, much of the sanctions regime is also going to start to crumble, because a lot of countries have gone along with these sanctions reluctantly because they believe that Iran was in the wrong. Well, if you have a deal and Congress causes it to fall apart, then it's not any longer Iran that is in the wrong, and it's going to be the United States. And that will cause, at a minimum, the discipline of the implementation of the sanctions to reduce significantly. So if you then have a scenario in which the Iranian program doesn't have the restrictions, not even the ones that it has today, and at the same time, the sanctions are falling apart, I believe it is quite likely that the pressure for military action will increase quite significantly. That may not have the effect on the current president, but the next president of the United States, he or she will, during his or her first year in office, be under tremendous amount of pressure to take military action if the restrictions are gone and the sanctions are falling apart as well. That's point number two. Point number three goes to what Mark talked about when it comes to whether this is transactional or transformational. I fully understand why neither the Europeans or the president want to necessarily touch this argument or sell this as on the basis of its ability to transform the Iranian society. But I think it actually does have a very decent chance of doing so. I think this is more than just about enrichment. This can come to define who decides the direction of Iran for the next generation. I think one of the things that the United States and the West has going for itself is the fact that the Iranian society is probably the most moderate society in the entire Muslim Middle East. The rest of the Middle East tends to be ruled by autocrats, pretty bad autocrats, but at the end of the day, for better or for worse, they oftentimes tend to be more moderate than the populations that they're ruling. Iran is the big exception, in which it has a society that is far more moderate and forward-looking than the current regime. The deal can unleash this society and enable it to make the changes inside of Iran that no one else can. Only the Iranian people can do this. And that struggle for a much more progressive and democratic direction for the country is more than a century old, and has oftentimes been stifled by tensions between the United States and the outside world. And that was very, very clear during the Ahmadinejad years. That can be undone. The society can be unleashed. And we can have a scenario, which obviously will take time. We're talking about a generational shift, in which you will have in Iran that actually much more reflects the moderation of its society rather than the current situation. Stake number 3 is what's going to happen when it comes to the regional conflicts, particularly the spread of radicalism, the rise of ISIS, and terrorist organizations, primarily Sunni terrorist organizations that are destabilizing the region. There is some indirect collaboration between the United States and Iran right now. It's quite clear. You can see it in Iraq. It's going through the Iraqi government, but it's there. But it's very, very limited compared to what it could be. In a post-deal scenario, when the United States no longer has to worry about that, if it actually collaborates a little bit too much with the Iranians, it will cause even more panic in Saudi Arabia. In a post-deal scenario, some of those fears may be out the window, and there may be an opportunity to be able to pursue this. A very interesting quote coming from the Iranian National Security Advisor in December of last year. Asked whether the deal would lead to Iran and the United States becoming allies, the answer was no. The United States and Iran are not going to become allies, and I don't think he shocked anyone. There is no constituency in the United States or in Iran that is pushing for this to become a full-blown alliance or falling in love with each other, as Mark put it. But he added, the United States and Iran can cease using their energy against each other. That would be a game changer in the region, because for the last 20 years, the United States and Iran have done everything they could to either contain Iran or, in the case of the Iranians, undermine the United States in the region. And they have spent a tremendous amount of resources and political capital to do so. The statement that they could cease doing this would change a lot, and it would open up the opportunities as well for further collaboration against movements that clearly the United States see as being absolutely critical in their, or extensive in their threat to stability in the region. I don't know, was that point number 3, or let me just check mine? That was number 4, okay. So then the last point. Mark mentioned about falling in love with Iran. The Iranian National Security Advisor, Shamkhani, said that it's not going to be an alliance. And I think there's a guy at Brookings who put it the best. This is not about going into bed with Tehran. It is, however, going to help getting out of bed with Saudi Arabia. What the deal can do is that it can add maneuverability to the United States when it deals with problems in the region. Mike Mullen had, former head of the Joint Chief of Staff, had an op-ed in the Politico, I think about 6 or 7 weeks ago. It was very interesting because he essentially said that the deal will help us recalibrate our relations, reassess our relations with some of the Sunni kingdoms in the region, and recalibrate the balance when it comes to the Sunni-Shia divide. I think essentially what he was saying was it will give America options in the region. Our dependence on some of these states has caused us not to be able to take them on and have an adult conversation with them when we have had major problems, such as the tremendous amount of money that is going from some of these states to terrorist organizations that are targeting not just massive amount of Muslims in the Middle East, but have also wreaked havoc in Europe and attacked America at its home soil. That conversation thus far seems to have been very limited compared to what it could be. And if the United States has a more balanced relationship in the region, when it is no longer that dependent on any one specific bloc or any one specific state, its ability to deal with some of these issues is going to increase. And I found it tremendously telling that it was the head, the top military person in the United States government who just left a year or so, who came out and said this. I think it tells you a lot about who is really feeling the pressure and the tension from the inability of the United States to deal with some of its allies in a more direct way. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trita. I'm glad that we actually arranged it this way, because you ended up on such a good, positive, forward-looking note. and your enthusiasm is catching. Let's have a discussion for the next 25 minutes. Greg Tillman, please. Do we have a microphone? The microphone is for the purposes of recording. I no doubt I could hear you even without the microphone, but the recorder can't pick it up.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. This week we heard from a panel at the Hudson Institute that the biggest threat posed by the emerging agreement is that of nuclear-tipped long-range ballistic missiles, and that since there's no limit on ballistic missiles in the agreement, that the Iranians will be unconstrained. The only reason to have long-range ballistic missiles is to deliver nuclear warheads, and ironically, it was also said that, well, even if they don't have nuclear warheads, it's a tremendous threat to Europe. So I guess my question is partly for Mark in terms of European reactions, it's partly for you both in terms of how one answers the absence of ballistic missiles argument. But the question for Mark in particular in Europe is, if there is a reduced intermediate range ballistic missile threat to Europe as a result of the agreement, will the Europeans put pressure on the U.S. to take seriously the European-phased adaptive approach by suspending or delaying interceptors in Poland, which are specifically designed to intercept Iranian intermediate-range ballistic missiles?
We should have a rule that people can't ask questions where they know so much more about the issue than the people being questioned. Yeah. It's a very good question. I need to pose that question when I get back to London eventually. I haven't myself been in conversations about whether they think that the phased adaptive approach ought to be further changed if there's a deal. It seems obvious to me that it does change the dynamics in a way that would make it reasonable to further delay implementation, but to keep it in place, the plans in place for if the deal goes sour, because Iran's missiles aren't constrained by the deal, but it's, they are constrained by the sanctions that remain and that I think will remain. I don't think that the new UN resolution, and we don't know exactly what it'll say, but I think it'll still have some constraints on Iran's ability to obtain the wherewithal to further their program that has not made the strides that they have been hoping for. It's been noticeably retarded. As you so well have pointed out, that 2015 intercontinental ballistic missile isn't around the corner from Iran. Yeah,
I know nothing about missiles. I still have 3 things to say. The first one is, I think, just to keep an understanding as to why the Iranians have a ballistic missile program. They didn't have a ballistic missile program during the Iraq-Iran war, and they were hit extensively by Scud missiles by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam had the ability to hit Tehran from the most western point of Iraq. The Iranians retaliated because they only had short-range missiles, and they had to, in order to retaliate and hit Baghdad, they had to be inside Iraqi territory in order to be able to reach Baghdad, whereas Saddam could hit Tehran all the way from the western point of Iraq. And that fueled their desire to make sure that they had ballistic missiles, because there was no other protection against ballistic missiles than having your own in order to be able to retaliate, at least that's their calculation. The second point is that there's a lot of criticisms that come forward against the deal, and it's coming, I would say, I find it somewhat amusing that those who never believed in diplomacy, who never wanted to see diplomacy, who did everything they could to prevent diplomacy, now are advising the president on how to conduct diplomacy. They had options. They never did it. They have no experience with diplomacy, because every time there was an opportunity to negotiate with the Iranians, they never did it. They rejected every opportunity. So on what basis of experience are they telling the administration that they could actually do a better job? The third point I forgot, but it was a great one. I'll remind you.
Let's go to Ed Ift and then Mark. And then
Edward Ift, Georgetown University. Yesterday I was in a meeting in which, once again, the argument broke out over whether Iran has the right to enrich, which strikes me as a sort of theological argument, but it's clearly a point of principle for Iran. The argument was made that this agreement gives Iran a right to enrich, which it did not have already under the NPT. I think that's wrong, but what is your view?
You know, I think that issue was decided in November 2013 under the Joint Plan of Action, and the months ahead of that, the Joint Plan of Action agreed that Iran would be allowed enrichment, something that until then the position had been they should at least it should be suspended, and the U.S. position was no enrichment. So that was decided back then that Iran should be allowed to have a limited enrichment program, and Iran agreed that the Joint Plan of Action did not have to include the words "the right to enrich." That was a very skillful decision on Zarif's part, knowing that it was difficult for the United States to put that in writing because of the differences on whether, in fact, the NPT incorporates that right. So that's not going to, I think, be in the comprehensive Joint Plan of Action either, because it's basically an old issue that's we've overcome that, and if people are still arguing about it, you know, I think it's an argument just for the purposes of having an argument, not because it's a serious issue anymore. Mark Katz?
Thank you. Mark Katz from George Mason University. And my question definitely conforms to Mark's rule that I don't know more than the speakers. I'm wondering if either or both of you would care to speculate on what, if any, impact the Iranian nuclear deal would have on the larger strategic balance. In other words, does it have any impact on the Russian-Western competition? Does it have any impact on how China rises? And the reason I ask is that, you know, at conferences this past year in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, you know, I hear more and more about the, you know, Sunni-Shia coming conflict. And I hear, you know, a desire on their part, well, if the United States isn't willing to help us, you know, we have other alternatives, you know, Russia, China, India, although I don't hear people from these governments being terribly eager to come in. But what can you tell us a little bit about what you might think sort of the larger implications of this might be? Thank you.
You have any thoughts on that, Peter?
Just a few comments. I think it's a great question, and there's a lot of unknowns there. I think one of the things we can say it does that it actually puts Iran in play, in the sense that the Russians and the Chinese thus far have been pretty confident that Iran is an anti-Western government, and they like to keep it that way. And as a result, they felt that Iran was so deep in that camp that they didn't have to spend much resources in order to be able to curry favor with Tehran. The Iranians were trying for quite some time to try to get the Chinese to agree that to have a strategic relationship with Iran. And they failed up until a year and a half ago, in which it is actually the Chinese that are on numerous occasions gone to the Iranian foreign minister and says that they view their relationship with Iran as being strategic. Just today, I think Lavrov said that there's no opposition any longer in order for Iran to be able to join the Shanghai conference. So what you have is a situation in which the Chinese and the Russians realize that Iran may orient itself a bit more towards the West. Not to say that it's going to become a Western ally, but it's going to be a little bit more in play. You have to actually spend resources in order to ensure that it doesn't go all the way. And that's part of the reason why there's been a lot of effort, particularly from the Chinese side, to be able to strengthen relationship with Iran, which is also motivated to a certain extent by their desire to reduce their dependence on Saudi Arabia. Now, whether this will have when some of the GCC states say that they're going to go, and they have other options, I'm sure they do. I don't think the United States is particularly worried about that, though.
And I'll just add to that, one of the other options, the best option for the GCC states, in addition to the United States, is their relationship with Europe. The French and the Brits have increased their foothold in the region and offering defense relationships separate from that of the United States. And I think that's important, that's useful for them to have those other options. But the idea that they would look to Russia or China for security options, I think that's pretty far-fetched. Two other thoughts. It's been very interesting to me that Russia has been in such solidarity with its other partners in these negotiations, when if you total up what would seem to be in Russia's interests of not having a deal that would put more oil on the market and thereby reduce the prices in their take, a deal that would shift Iran more toward the United States and reduce its reliance on Russia, a deal that would open up trade and allow Iran to stop having to buy cheap, inferior goods from Eastern partners and better goods that they want from the West. You would all think that for Russia's purposes, it's probably better not to have a deal. But they've been pretty good about keeping this consensus. It's the one area where Russia and the United States have been cooperating in a nuclear policy. For China, in terms of the larger strategic equation, what Trita said about the impact of this deal putting the military option off the table, it's still in the backdrop. It's important to have that military option as a means of deterrence. That it's a reason, I think, that Iran will keep abiding by the deal, because there always would be that military option. But taking the military option off the table for now, reducing the possibility of a new war in the Middle East, allows the United States to continue its longer-term strategic plan of a rebalance toward Asia. And that's certainly in America's benefit. Gentleman way in the back there, in the second to last row or last row.
Thank you.
Peter, sorry.
Yes. Peter Topickanov, Carnegie Moscow Center, Russia. To continue Russian role in the Iranian deal, what do you think about the prospects for nuclear cooperation between Russia and Iran after contracts and decisions signed in Moscow last November on continuation of nuclear cooperation in the field of nuclear peaceful energy between Iran and Russia? I remember in previous years you had questions about some projects between Russia and Iran, but what do you think about the prospects in the framework of this deal between Iran and 6 countries and between Iran and Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I have, I guess, voiced in public some suspicions about what might be unwritten in that deal that Russia and Iran had signed, whether it would have given Iran a greater rationale for producing enriched uranium on its own because of the parts of the clause that talked about Iran involvement in fuel fabrication. But so far, so good. Iran was willing to put off for 15 years any capability to replace Russia's provision of fuel for the Bushehr reactor. And I hope that they continue to put it off because it doesn't make any economic sense. And the deal that Russia struck with Iran was not only to provide the reactors, but to continue to provide the fuel for the reactors. So again, Iran has no economic incentive to produce large amounts of low-enriched uranium for fuel that Russia's already contracted to provide. The uneasy part of this is that the speed with, and this is not the nuclear deal, this is another issue, but the speed with which President Putin removed the restriction on the sale of the S-300 anti-aircraft, anti-missile, one wishes he could have waited a couple months until the deal was actually in place. I guess he wanted to get his foot in the door and show Iran that Russia really was their best friend. Good luck to him in making that stick. Yeah, next, in the back, yes.
David Abreu from Center for American Security. I just want to know, what do you think the impact of the deal would have on Arab countries in the Gulf? Do you think it would create tension where you have Saudi Arabia and UAE kind of differing on how they feel about the deal?
Sure. I think actually it's a great opportunity. I think the paradigm for security in the Persian Gulf has been a balance of power paradigm. The GCC was created in order to balance Iraq and Iran, but primarily Iran, of course. And that balancing game creates small windows of stability, but a tremendous amount of tension that is bottled up. And when it comes out, it can be quite disastrous. You have a tremendous amount of opposition from Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's important to keep in mind Saudi Arabia is not the entire Arab world, nor is it even the entire GCC. Oman is having a very different position than what the Saudis do, not even just on Iran, but see their position on Yemen. They have not accepted the Saudi narrative on what is happening in Yemen. Similarly, Qatar's foreign minister just came out and expressed hope for the deal to be struck and said that they have confidence in their Western allies and in the promises and et cetera that they're given. The Saudis have a different situation. And I think the problem that the Saudis are facing is that they have had numerous strategic trends that have gone in their opposite direction of their interest for more than a decade and a half now. First, you have the fact that with the invasion of Iraq, the United States destroyed the previous order that existed in the region. It was an American-built order, and it was also an American destruction of that order. That order had two main benefactors, Israel and Saudi Arabia. And there is a desire in Saudi Arabia, a strong one, to have the United States recreate the pre-2003 order that existed in the region. There's essentially two ways that you could do that. You could either make sure that Iraq and Afghanistan are amazing successes, and as a result, they continue to balance and box in Iran. Or if that doesn't work, which it clearly doesn't seem to be working, is that you have to cut down Iran in size. Otherwise, you have a new geopolitical situation in which the Iranians have been unleashed and are far more powerful. That's point number one. But there are other issues. In fact, the Iran issue is probably the least important. It's the one that comes in last. It is the fact that the energy revolution in the United States with shale oil, etc., has actually significantly reduced the Saudi influence on the oil market and has reduced America's dependence on Saudi Arabia. And it's happening much, much faster than anyone had predicted. You combine that with also what is happening in the Arab world, where the Saudis have lost a lot of their allies and a lot of the clout that they had. You have tremendous instability, a rejection of the old political orders that existed inside the countries. The fact that the United States, as Mark mentioned, its strategic objective is to refocus on Asia and not get dragged into wars in the Middle East over and over again. All of these things added together create the sense of panic that I think is currently reigning in Saudi Arabia. And on top of that, if you suddenly have the United States and Iran stop being enemies and potentially improving their relationship, even though there's not an alliance, that's when you have the full-blown thing coming. Because what the U.S.-Iran thing can do is that it can cement many of the other existing trends and make sure that they're irreversible. This is what's causing it. But it's important to realize that in a previous era, just 15, 16 years ago, prior to these other trends taking place, the Saudis and the Iranians had a rapprochement. And the Saudis probably would not have been delighted about a U.S.-Iran deal at the time, but it would not have caused the type of a panic that we're seeing right now. And the root of that panic is these other trends that have taken place.
Thanks, Trita. The gentleman, third row in the back, and then Oliver up here.
Hi, Ken Myrick, World Docs. No matter what happens with the negotiations, if the U.S. sanctions remain in place, would that argue that the folderol over the Iranian nuclear program is really a red herring meant to conceal the real issue, which is the question of strategic control of the Persian Gulf?
There's a couple issues packed in there. Let me address a couple of them. U.S. sanctions will remain in place. I can't imagine Congress removing them entirely. It took them how many years, how many decades to remove the sanctions on the Soviet Union after the Soviet Jews were allowed to freely emigrate, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The Treasury's designation of Iran as a area of money laundering concern, or a nation of money laundering concern, I think that'll remain in place, and that will impede the trade that Iran is hoping for. I meant to say in my presentation that it's something that Europeans worry about, that the deal won't bring to Iran the benefits that it has been counting on because of the remaining restrictions in place by the United States, and maybe more importantly, because of the concern, the worry that international financiers and traders will have about falling afoul somehow of the U.S. sanctions and again being exposed to multi-billion-dollar fines. So Europeans hope that America will pave the way for legitimate transactions by designating certain banking channels and so forth. The main part of your question goes to what's the real issue here. As a non-proliferation wonk, I firmly believe that the real issue is and has been the nuclear shadow that Iran has been casting, and that's been getting darker and darker. It's the issue that really could cause the United States to get involved in a military conflict with Iran. All the other issues between the United States and Iran are not matters of war and peace. And if you remove this issue that could cause war, there's potential for a lot else to happen. So I reject the contention that this is all, the nuclear issue is just a facade for some deeper set of issues. Yeah, there are deeper animosities between Iran and the United States. A lot of us still remember very vividly when the hostages were taken, and the Iranians still remember very vividly the insults that were foisted upon them. But let's remove this issue that impedes communications and that could cause war. Additional?
I could just add one thing. I agree with Mark that at the end of the day, it is the nuclear issue that could cause the United States and Iran ending up in a military confrontation. At the same time, I think the nuclear issue is a symptom of a deeper U.S.-Iran problem that has existed and that is rooted in the geopolitics of the region. I think when the question is about the control of the Persian Gulf, my own perspective is that I think there are people in the U.S. government that have come to the conclusion that the utility of keeping control of the Persian Gulf has actually reduced significantly as a result of the reduction of, or the increase of American oil production itself. Combined with the fact that the cost of being the hegemon of the Persian Gulf has increased dramatically as a result of the previous 2003 order collapsing, and now we're seeing the collapsing of the states within a collapsing of a state system. Being the hegemon under these circumstances pretty much sucks. And as a result, what you want to get out of is...
We're recorded here,
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to put a beep on that, I guess. So what you want to do is you want to get out of the situation in which all of the cost and the burden of that falls on the back of the United States, particularly if that would be in such a way that the order itself does not have indigenous legs to stand on. I mean, the order that existed between 1992 and 2003, essentially wrapped up in dual containment. That doctrine essentially said that we're going to have an order in the region by excluding Iraq and Iran. It would be the containment of these two states. Any order that is based on excluding two of the most powerful states of that region can only live if it is paid for and fought for by an external, much more powerful power. And that's what it was. It didn't have the legs to stand on its own. If you want to reduce the cost and still have stability, you need to have an indigenously rooted order, which is going to be a very tricky thing, but it means that at some point you need to get the Saudis and the Iranians on talking terms. You need to find a way in which they create their own structure of order that is driven by their own resources and their own ability, instead of having the United States essentially babysitting this region internally.
Okay, I got to thank the gentleman for posing a question that finally brought out a difference between me and Trita. Whether this nuclear issue is the main issue or a symptom of the main issue. I'm going to call on Oliver Meyer, another non-proliferation wonk, who will side with me in this debate, I presume.
You stack the room with your friends.
Oliver Meyer, I'm with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. And sitting in Berlin, I just wanted to echo Mark's impression that Europeans are basically now thinking about how to implement the deal rather than about the pros and cons of the deal. I think that shift has taken place with the agreement in Lausanne, and the debate about the details of whether this is a good or a bad deal is a thing. I think that's pretty much a past debate in Europe. And I think for three reasons, on top of the many good reasons that the both of you have given. One is the possible positive implication for the non-proliferation regime more generally of a possible deal, particularly after the failed NPT review conference. I think Europeans are very keen on this. They have a vested interest in strengthening the non-proliferation regime, and this is something that they're very interested in. The second reason I think you've referred to already, and that is that this is an area where we can keep cooperation with Russia going on. A positive spin on the question on the Ukraine file, and that's why I think particularly in Berlin, many people are concerned about linking the two files, the Ukraine file and the Iran file. There have been references both in Moscow, I think also in Washington, to using the leverage that one could get by linking the two files, that this is a temptation to do that, and I think there's concern about that in Europe. And the third reason is linked to that, and that is to the sanctions question. If Congress, for example, were to veto a deal and this would lead to unraveling, this would put serious strain on transatlantic relations. On top of the many problems we're having already in transatlantic relations, this would be very problematic, particularly because of the extraterritorial sanctions that the US still would maintain. Many Europeans, including myself, would see these as illegal, and that would seriously be a problem, I think, for transatlantic relations. So let me ask you a question on the post-deal phase against that background, and that's related to the institutional underpinning, if you like, of implementing a deal. This will be an unprecedented deal from a non-proliferation perspective. We've never had a serious problem like this resolved over such a long period with so many actors involved and so many different problems coming into play, from sanctions to the Iran side of implementing this. Are these institutions that we have sufficient for that? In the Lausanne Agreement, there's talk about a committee. Some are concerned that this could sideline the International Atomic Energy Agency. Don't we need a new kind of committee or a body where we could take concern and coordinate implementation of such a deal? I would be very interested in your take on that. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Oliver, for starting off laying out those three other reasons why the Europeans are very pleased to see a deal that will be coming forward. This is the most complicated set of arrangements that I can think of as well, the different players and the different mechanisms. I think one of the most complicated will be how the United Nations Security Council resolutions, all 6 of them to date, will be repackaged and carried forward, and how they will arrange a mechanism to monitor Iran's procurement of equipment necessary and sufficient for their limited program, but not excess that would enable clandestine production. That's very complicated, and I know there are debates about whether the United Nations Sanctions Committee and the panel of experts should be tasked with that and that their mechanism strengthened. For me, the IAEA should remain central to this. They've got the history and the capabilities, and they know how to do these kind of things. And I suppose some of that is still in play. Other mechanisms that are very tricky are how the dispute resolution mechanism. When the IAEA says we want to go to that nuclear facility and Iran objects, there's some dispute mechanism, and I guess Iran will have a vote in that, but hopefully not a veto. And if it's the 6 powers that have been negotiating with Iran, the United States and its allies have a natural numerical advantage there. But I'm guessing this is going to be part of the very tricky aspects. It's one of the reasons why the deal could fall apart in the next 15 years if push comes to shove and there are differences over whether the IAEA should have access to some facility.
I think we're out of time. I just want to say there's one thing that you mentioned that I think is really, really important to emphasize, and some people have pointed it out, is that if we reach this deal, which I think we will, and if the deal ends up working pretty well, which I think it also will, it will be the first time in a very long time that there will actually be a major conflict internationally that was on the brink of war and then was settled through diplomacy, and the end result was a compromise. I don't think there's a lot of examples you can find in history in which humanity has been that humane.
And again, you've ended us on a positive note, and I think we'll stop the discussion here. Thank you very much for taking time out from your mornings, and thank Srita for joining me on the panel. We really appreciate you all coming and having a discussion on this vital issue. I'm going to be around for another half an hour or so if anybody wants to chat more, and otherwise, see you next time.
Thanks so much, Mark. This was excellent. Yeah, sorry about the profanity.
Mr. Lanham, that was not a profanity. That's the title of my next essay.